At 78, Benny Andersson has chosen to speak in a way he never dared during ABBA's glory years. For decades, fans only saw the polished perfection of the Swedish supergroup, but Benny's truth reveals a much darker story beneath the surface. Behind every cheerful chorus and shimmering harmony was a man using music to survive his own silence, his own detachment, and the fractures that were quietly destroying the band. For the first time, he admits that the very songs that made the world dance were built on pain he couldn't face in words. Benny is no longer protecting the myth. He is finally telling the story that had always been hiding behind the melodies. The architect of ABBA's sound. Before ABBA became the polished pop phenomenon of the 1970s, Benny Andersson's life was shaped by a very different kind of music. Born in Stockholm in 1946, he grew up surrounded by the sounds of accordions, folk traditions, and church harmonies. Those early influences would stay with him forever, giving his music a depth that stood apart from the simple dance beats dominating radio. While many musicians of his generation chased fame from the beginning, Benny was more fascinated by chords and arrangements, by how emotion could be built through tension and release. In the late 1960s, his path crossed with Björn Ulvaeus. The partnership was instant and natural. Björn focused on lyrics and narrative, while Benny became the architect of the melodies, the man who could turn a single chord progression into something that carried both joy and sadness. Together, they found a balance most bands never achieved. Benny was relentless in the studio. Stories from those years recall him replaying a single harmony for hours, searching not for technical perfection, but for honesty. Every note had to match the emotion in his mind, and he would not stop until it did. This commitment shaped ABBA's identity when the group formally formed in 1972 with Agnetha Fältskog and Annie Frid-Lyngstad. As the voices of Agnetha and Frida soared, it was Benny's arrangements underneath that gave the songs their haunting complexity. Even Dancing Queen, the group's most euphoric hit released in 1976, carried a bittersweet undercurrent that audiences felt without always understanding why. That contrast, happiness on the surface, sorrow beneath, was Benny's doing. He insisted that ABBA's music could never be one-dimensional. Love hurts in harmony. Benny Andersson and Annie Frid-Lyngstad, known to fans simply as Frida, were never meant to be just colleagues. Their story began in the late 1960s, when both were carving out careers in Sweden's growing music scene. Frida was fiery, charismatic, and fiercely determined to stand on her own in a male-dominated industry. Benny, by contrast, was quiet, methodical, and already gaining a reputation for being a musical perfectionist. What started as collaboration quickly grew into something deeper. By the time ABBA was formally born in 1972, they were both partners in music and in life. In the early days, their connection seemed unshakable. Late nights in the studio blurred the line between work and romance. Frida brought raw emotional intensity to every recording, while Benny translated unspoken feelings into chords and harmonies. Music was their language, and it often felt as though the songs carried conversations they couldn't have in real life. For the public, their partnership looked like a fairy tale, two brilliant artists creating magic together while building a life side by side. But as ABBA's fame skyrocketed through the mid-1970s, the very qualities that made them great collaborators began to erode their personal bond. Benny's relentless pursuit of structure and precision clashed with Frida's need for openness and emotional expression. He wanted control. She wanted freedom. She poured herself into the lyrics, living every word, while Benny increasingly used the studio as a shield, hiding behind melodies instead of confronting real conversations. By 1978, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Rumors of Benny's infidelity began to surface, and although they were denied at first, the truth eventually emerged. For Frida, the betrayal was devastating. She had given not only her heart to Benny, but also her artistic soul to their shared dream. To discover that he had been unfaithful shattered her trust and left her feeling humiliated before both the band and the public. What fans saw as glamorous photographs of a perfect couple were, in reality, moments staged against a backdrop of growing resentment and heartbreak. The songs that emerged during this period became emotional battlegrounds. Tracks like "The Winner Takes It All" carried the rawness of separation. Though sung by Agnetha, it reflected the personal collapses both couples within ABBA were experiencing. For Frida, singing Benny's words felt like reopening wounds that had never healed. For Benny, composing those ballads was easier than facing the pain directly. He later admitted that he gave his best lines to songs instead of to the people who needed to hear them. It was a quiet confession that revealed how he used music not as a bridge, but as a way to avoid vulnerability. By 1981, their marriage had fully unraveled. Frida moved on more quickly, emotionally detaching herself from the band before its official end, while Benny carried the weight of guilt and silence for years. Their relationship, once the creative and emotional core of ABBA, dissolved under the same pressure that had fueled the band's greatest music. And though the world adored the songs born from that heartbreak, the personal cost was far heavier than fans ever imagined. The silent rivalry. Fans and tabloids loved to imagine that ABBA's tension came from rivalry between the two women, Agnetha Fältskog and Annie Fried Lyngstad. The contrast between Agnetha's blonde, ethereal image and Frida's darker, dramatic stage presence made for an easy story. Two divas secretly fighting for the spotlight. But Benny Andersson has admitted that the real rivalry was never between the singers at all. The true conflict was his private struggle with recognition, a silent battle against the way fame worked. In every photo shoot, the cameras lingered on the women. Their outfits, their beauty, their supposed personal dramas filled the headlines. Björn and Benny, the very men who wrote the songs, were quietly relegated to the background. They were the brains, the songwriters, the men behind the curtain. To the world, they were technicians rather than artists. For Benny, this cut deep. He wasn't chasing celebrity, but he wanted people to see that the chords, the structure, the emotion, the very soul of ABBA was his language. The irony was cruel. Benny was often described as the cold brain of ABBA, as though he were a machine turning out perfect formulas. In truth, he was pouring his soul into every arrangement. He labored over harmonies, layered instruments with painstaking detail, and pushed the boundaries of studio technology. Early synthesizers, multi-track recordings, and bold use of silence itself became his tools. Yet when awards were given or magazines celebrated ABBA's success, Benny's name was often little more than a footnote. This mislabeling followed him long after ABBA's golden years. Critics dismissed the music as simple pop fluff, ignoring the depth that came from his craftsmanship. Benny later admitted that he would read reviews hoping someone might notice the structure of his compositions, the emotional complexity hidden beneath the hooks. Most didn't. The applause went to the singers, while his own sacrifices were invisible. That invisibility became its own form of rivalry, not against his bandmates, but against perception itself. Over time, Benny stopped trying to fight the narrative. He turned to projects where he could exert full creative control, like the musicals Chess and Kristina från Duvemåla. In these works, he could experiment freely, and the recognition was his alone. Yet even in those moments of triumph, he carried the frustration of knowing that history would remember ABBA's faces more than the man who had given the group its heartbeat. The unraveling. By the late 1970s, ABBA looked unstoppable. Every single they released topped charts across Europe, Australia, and eventually the United States. Tours sold out stadiums, television appearances reached millions, and their image was one of effortless harmony. But inside the group, exhaustion and disillusionment were taking root. The decline wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a slow erosion, like a house quietly rotting from within. The endless touring schedules drained the members physically and emotionally. Night after night of performing left them too tired to communicate with each other beyond the stage. In the studio, Benny pushed for perfection with the same relentless intensity as always, but the spark that had once driven the group began to fade. For him, the music no longer felt honest. He recalls moments in 1980 when he realized the songs they were creating no longer resonated in the same way. The joy had been replaced by duty, and duty alone could not keep the band alive. Benny later admitted that by the time ABBA slowed down in 1982, he wasn't there out of love for the music anymore. He stayed because he felt guilty, because he didn't want to let the others down, because walking away from something so massive felt impossible. The passion was gone, but the pressure to maintain the machine remained crushing. What had begun as a dream now felt like a trap. The end itself was strikingly quiet. There was no dramatic breakup press conference, no heated confrontation. It was simply a fade into silence. Each member drifted in their own direction, and the band never truly sat down together to acknowledge that it was over. Newspapers speculated, fans begged for clarity, but inside the group there was only unspoken acceptance. The music had run its course. Frida detached more quickly, finding ways to move on emotionally even before the final years. For Benny, it was different. He carried the silence for another decade, haunted by the unresolved ending. He described those years as a kind of creative death, his body moving through projects, but his heart stuck in the collapse of ABBA. Fans searched for scandal, but the truth was less dramatic and more painful. The group had simply burned out, drained of the very energy that had once made their songs immortal. A composer in exile. When ABBA's final curtain fell in 1982, Benny Andersson disappeared from the glare of pop stardom. To fans, it seemed like retreat, but for him, it was survival. The years of pressure, the fractured relationships, and the silent collapse of the group had left him hollow. He turned not to rest, but to composition, searching for peace in new projects that didn't demand costumes, cameras, or chart dominance. In the 1980s, he and Björn Ulvaeus poured their creative energy into Chess, the musical that premiered in London in 1986. For Benny, this was more than just a career move. It was therapy. The story of rivalries and emotional battles set against the Cold War mirrored his own inner struggles. He could layer complexity into the score without worrying about pop formulas, and for the first time in years, he felt free to write without compromise. The reception was mixed, but the process gave him space to rebuild his artistic identity. By the 1990s, he was working on Kristina från Duvemåla, a sweeping Swedish-language musical that explored themes of exile, survival, and longing. The project took years to develop and eventually premiered in 1995. Its story of immigrants searching for a new life resonated deeply with Benny, who had long felt like an exile in his own way, trapped by fame, misunderstood by the public, and burdened by unspoken guilt. The music carried his most personal emotions, layered into orchestral arrangements that allowed him to say what words never could. During this period, Benny kept journals filled with unsent letters to his former bandmates. He admitted later that he wrote to Frida, Agnetha, and Björn about things he hadn't dared to express when ABBA was active. They were raw confessions of guilt, regret, and affection. Though he never mailed them, the act of writing was a form of release. It was as if he had finally found a way to speak without hiding behind melody. By the time he reached his 60s, Benny began to embrace a new role. No longer the silent architect in the background, he became a mentor to young Scandinavian composers. He taught them not just the technical skills of arranging or composing, but the importance of emotional honesty. He told them what he had failed to tell himself in the 1970s, that silence, even in the form of music, can wound as deeply as anger, the final truth. Now, at 78, Benny Andersson has stopped hiding behind melodies. In a rare interview, he delivered the confession that fans had long suspected but never heard confirmed. ABBA was never built on fairy tale joy. It was built on pain, escape, and fragile humanity. ABBA worked because we were broken, he said. The music made us feel whole. Those words struck like thunder because they reframed the entire history of the band. For decades, ABBA had been remembered as the sound of carefree happiness, glittering outfits, sparkling harmonies, and dance floors packed with joy. But Benny's words revealed what lay beneath. The joy was real but incomplete, a mask covering fractures that were already there. The songs were lifelines, not celebrations. Each track was a way for four fragile people to keep moving forward when everything else was pulling them apart. Looking back, Benny admitted he once thought time would bring closure, that years away from the band would ease the weight of what happened. Instead, time only brought clarity. He now sees ABBA not as flawless legends, but as four human beings desperately trying not to fall apart. The music was both their refuge and their prison. It connected them but also prevented them from confronting their real struggles. Fans always wanted scandal or betrayal to explain the end, but Benny's version is quieter and far more tragic. The collapse wasn't about the tabloids, the pressure of fame, or even the fractured relationships. It was about humanity. The group had given everything, creatively, emotionally, personally, until nothing was left. The music that united millions could not save the people who made it. At 78, Benny no longer chases applause or legacy. What he wants is truth. He admits that ABBA survived as long as it did not because they were perfect, but because the music filled the gaps left by their brokenness. The melodies were their therapy, their escape, their only way to keep going. But even music has limits, and in the end, it could not hold them together. And so, after half a century, Benny Andersson has finally said what many suspected all along. ABBA was held together not by perfection, but by pain and survival. Their songs endure because they speak to the fragile parts of all of us. What do you think? Does Benny's confession change how you hear ABBA's music today? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories behind the legends.